Have you ever heard of the Russian sleep experiment? It is one of the most chilling legends to ever crawl out of the dark corners of the internet. The story goes that back in the late 1940s, Soviet researchers, deep in the grip of the Cold War, decided to push the limits of human endurance. They wanted to see what would happen if a person was deprived of sleep for an extended period. To do this, they selected 5 political prisoners, individuals deemed expendable by the state, and locked them in a sealed gas chamber. The experiment was deceptively simple. Keep them awake for 30 days straight. To achieve this, they would continuously pump an experimental stimulant gas into the chamber. The subjects were monitored constantly through thick glass portholes and microphones. To ensure their cooperation, they were given a promise, a beacon of hope in their grim reality. If they could endure the 30 days without sleep, they would be granted their freedom. For men who had lost everything, this was a powerful incentive. For the first few days, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The prisoners, initially wary, began to open up. Their conversations, picked up by the microphones, were normal, even mundane. They talked about their families, their homes, their past lives, the lives that had been stolen from them. They shared stories, cracked jokes, and supported one another. A fragile sense of camaraderie formed in that sealed room. They were surviving. The researchers watched, took notes, and felt a cautious optimism. The gas was working. The subjects were awake, lucid, and cooperating. The promise of freedom seemed to be a potent motivator. And for 5 full days, the chamber was filled with the sounds of human connection against a backdrop of scientific observation. But as the days stretched on, something began to shift. Around day 5, the tone of their conversations started to darken. The hopeful talks of family and home faded away, replaced by discussions of the traumas they had endured, the injustices they had suffered. Paranoia began to seep into their interactions, like a poison. They started whispering to each other, turning against one another, accusing each other of being informants for the research. The camaraderie that had bonded them just days earlier was fracturing, crumbling under the immense pressure of sleeplessness and confinement. The researchers noted this psychological decay but continued the experiment. This was, after all, what they were there to study. By day 9, the transformation was terrifying. The prisoners had stopped talking to each other altogether. Instead, they took turns whispering into the microphones. Bizarre, disjointed monologues. They spoke of dark, abstract things, of fears and horrors that seemed to rise from the deepest recesses of their minds. The content was so disturbing, so nonsensical, that the researchers couldn't make sense of it. It was as if the constant wakefulness had unlocked a part of their brain that was never meant to be accessed. They were no longer the men who had entered the chamber. They were becoming something else entirely, something hollowed out and filled with a nameless dread. The atmosphere in the control room grew tense. The scientists, once detached observers, were now witnesses to a complete mental collapse. Then, on the 11th day, the whispering stopped and the screaming began. It was a raw, primal sound, a shriek of pure terror and agony that went on for hours. They would scream until their vocal cords tore, until all that was left was a hoarse, guttural croak. The researchers watched, horrified, through the glass portholes as one of the subjects ran back and forth across the length of the chamber, screaming relentlessly until his voice gave out. After the screaming fits, a new, even more disturbing behavior emerged. The subjects began tearing pages out of the books they'd been given for entertainment. But they didn't read them. Instead, they defecated on the pages and, using the foul mixture as a paste, began smearing it over the glass portholes. Methodically, one by one, they blocked the researchers' view, sealing themselves in darkness. They wanted to be unseen. They wanted complete and total blackness. Then, as suddenly as it began, the screaming stopped, and silence fell over the chamber. A heavy, suffocating silence. For 3 whole days, there was nothing. No sound, no movement visible through the tiny gaps they hadn't covered. The researchers grew frantic. Had the subjects died? Were they plotting something? They checked the oxygen monitors. The readings confirmed that all 5 were still alive. In fact, the oxygen consumption was incredibly high, indicating they were engaged in strenuous physical activity. But what could they be doing? The silence was more unnerving than the screaming had ever been. The mystery of what was happening behind those smeared windows was maddening. On the morning of the 15th day, the researchers, unable to bear the suspense any longer, decided to break protocol. They would open the chamber. They announced their intentions over the intercom, stating that they were coming in to test the microphones and that the subjects should lie flat on the floor or they would be shot. They promised that compliance would earn one of them immediate freedom. To their surprise, a calm voice responded from within the chamber, a single, chilling sentence. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate raged among the research team and the military forces funding the project. Finally, the order was given. At midnight on the 15th day, the chamber was to be opened. The stimulant gas was purged and replaced with fresh air. Immediately, voices began to protest from inside. The subjects begged for the gas to be turned back on. They sounded desperate, terrified of falling asleep. Ignoring their pleas, soldiers stormed the chamber, ready for a confrontation. But nothing could have prepared them for what they found inside. The scene was a vision from hell. The chamber was a slaughterhouse. While 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, the state of their bodies was beyond comprehension. Food rations from the past several days lay untouched. Instead, chunks of flesh from their own thighs and chests had been torn off and stuffed into the floor drain, blocking it and allowing several inches of bloody water to pool on the floor. The subjects themselves were horribly mutilated. They had ripped off vast sections of their own skin and muscle with their bare hands. Their abdominal organs were visible through the gaping wounds in their torsos. Yet, they were alive. Not just alive, but conscious and walking around the chamber. When the soldiers tried to remove them, the prisoners fought back with a strength that seemed utterly inhuman. They raged, they clawed, they bit. They were like cornered animals, desperate and ferocious. During the struggle, one of the subjects had his spleen ruptured and bled out almost instantly. As he died, he was had to gasp the word more over and over again. The remaining subjects were eventually sedated and taken to a medical facility, though it took an unprecedented amount of morphine to have any effect. The one who could still speak was strapped to a table, being prepared for surgery to replace his mangled organs. As the anesthetic was being administered, he fought it off, smiling through a face that no longer had lips. When the doctor asked why he had done this to himself, why he refused to sleep, the prisoner's smile widened. "I must remain awake," he whispered. The remaining subjects echoed this sentiment. They begged for the stimulant gas, for anything that would keep them from the oblivion of sleep. They had to stay awake. When asked what they were so afraid of, what they had seen, one of the prisoners looked a soldier dead in the eye. A knowing, terrifying grin spread across his mutilated face. "Have you forgotten, Soizeli?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within all of you, begging to be free at the deepest, most animal part of your mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The implication was clear. They hadn't just been deprived of sleep. They had been deprived of the one thing that kept the darkness at bay. They had seen what waits for a soul in the shadows behind our eyes, and they could never, ever go back. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into one of the internet's most infamous legends, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the shadows. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Russian sleep experiment. Is it a cautionary tale, a government conspiracy, or just a terrifying piece of fiction? Stay curious, and see you in the next video.